All right, so this is like take two because I've been interrupted by the kids a couple of times and I've got COVID, so we're running short on fumes and patience here at the start. But welcome to the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey, and this is the Ben Franklin episode. I know that when most people get COVID, they lie down like some sort of half-dead dog for a week and complain about things. Me, I go right for the enlightenment and zero in, and we're going to do some great content delivery today. But I got to admit, I was kind of brain foggy, and instead of writing my usual 4,000 word script, I'm just going to kind of free verse it here. I got 500 words of stuff, but it's half written, to say the most for it. But anyway, I used to love teaching Ben Franklin. I taught early American Lit, so it would go from like 1492 to 1865. I mean, it was basically like there was one letter from Christopher Columbus, some Iroquois creation story, and then we would get to the Puritans. So basically the first 5 weeks of that class was reading stuff like, John Winthrop, William Bradford, John Cotton, Roger Williams, talking about Anne Hutchinson and the antinomian controversy where she sort of got kicked out, and then, of course, like the paradox of hierarchy in a Protestant church. So all this stuff was so interesting to me. And obviously, this would go, by the way, all the way 5 weeks, all the way up through, I'm trying to think what else, like Anne Bradstreet, Cotton Mather, the witch trials, sort of like all the way up through, and even Jonathan Edwards you could count. So up through week 5 or 6 of the semester, which, by the way, you should watch that. I think it was episode 49, the Jonathan Edwards one. It's good like background or like a good accompanying piece to this one, because Franklin and Edwards were almost exact contemporaries, born 3 years apart. But anyway, then in week 6, we would finally get to Ben Franklin, who, by the way, as I say, was just like should have been a Puritan. He was born in like almost the right place for it, at exactly the right time for it, to be a kind of Jonathan Edwards figure. And it always felt to me, I gotta say, when we started reading Ben Franklin, like, stripping off the old sweaty clothes and diving into Lake Michigan when you get to Ben Franklin. And why do I say that? Because Ben Franklin, like almost all at once, this guy just chucked it all, which, is a little bit of a too dramatic move probably, but it's like when you feel kind of like my students did, which was often overwhelmed and burdened by all this like Puritan moral seriousness, at the end of 5 or 6 weeks of that, Ben Franklin is funny, and he's much easier to read, and he seems more lively and certainly what I'm going to say is more modern, more recognizable, and more like us. And this is why we have him on our $100 Mammon bill, right? Anyway, so as you can imagine, I would always press my students very seriously to try really hard to get into the mindset of the Puritans. Take it seriously. Don't write them off as dumber than us just because they lived 400 years ago or whatever. But let's try to take them seriously on the question of conversion and revelation, right? Of the supernatural. And I would even go so far as to claim or suggest that maybe they did nothing wrong in hanging the 26 or so witches that they killed at Salem. And this would be, I think there's a verse in, I think it's like Exodus 18:22 or something, where it says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." So it's like, you claim to be a Christian, this says that in the Bible, let's kill the witches then. And it's like, okay. And I would always get one or two students who would admit, we would look at some of those polls from the Reuters or from who's the polling company, and it would say percentage of Americans that believe in X supernatural thing, like ghosts or wizards or witches or whatever. And America is way higher in answering those questions than almost, any first world country. You got 55% of Americans who believe in ghosts and stuff. So, I would always have some students who were on board with that. And I remember we would also read excerpts from Cotton Mather's book, which was called The Wonders of the Invisible World. And it was, I think, a 1685 or 1693 work that was basically just a collection of supernatural instances, people claiming to have seen phenomena, weird things were happening or whatever. So the point was that and by the way, that's what he was doing in that essay. If you're ever interested in reading Cotton Mather's biography, Mather was the grandson of John Cotton, his father or his grandfather, And he had this idea that, like, basically the first generations of Puritans were perfect, and then it was like worse, worse, worse. Kind of like Hesiod's creation. It's getting worse. It's getting farther from goodness. And so he wanted to call people back to that first generation, like, zeal. And to do that, he collected those wonders of the invisible world with the hope that, like, if you can prove to people by anecdote that people have experienced things that are not that seem like not physically demonstrable, then you might win them over to a more radical view, which would be open to revelation and conversion and so on. But anyway, a few of my students always seemed into it, as I said, but mostly they just kind of looked stupefied at all this Puritan stuff. The apparent exercise to them in, like, superstitious medievalism, it was just kind of mind-numbing, I think. But as I said, then in week 5, I would assign them this 20 or 30-page excerpt from Ben Franklin's autobiography. And you could kind of see the fog lift for them. Even his writing was easier for them to understand. And his way of thinking, as I say, was theirs. Okay, let's just leave the college students out of it. Enough about them, right? Because I know that they maybe weren't very, like, red-pilled or woke, and you guys are. And so there's this divergence about, like, well, what exactly was Ben Franklin? But I'm going to start with this. This is a quote. I'm going to break it into two here. It's basically one paragraph. And I want to start with this one so that we can think together about what this moment means and what it means specifically in relation to, like, the kinds of things you and I are interested in, right? Politically, socially, culturally, with the kind of reactionary bent that some of us have. It's like, well, what did this have to do with it, okay? So Ben Franklin. This is from his autobiography, by the way. I'm going to read most of it out of here. I have written some of it down, but this is my Norton anthology just because that's where all my underlines are. But this is how he starts this. And this is, I don't know, it's about halfway into his autobiography. He says, "Before I enter upon my public appearance in business, it may be well to let you know the then state of my mind with regard to my principles and morals, that you may see how far those influence the future events of my life. My parents had early given me religious impressions and brought me through my childhood piously in the dissenting way." So he was a Protestant, right? And then he says, "But I was scarce 15 when, after doubting by turns of several points, as I found them disputed in the different books I read, I began to doubt of revelation itself." Period. Okay, so wow. I mean, this drives me crazy sometimes. Okay, I'm going to continue on this paragraph, but before I do, let's just notice a few things about this. First, Franklin was a high school sophomore at this moment. The year would have been, he was born in 1706, so 1721, okay? 1721, and Ben Franklin, all of a sudden, because he read a little bit in books, decided that he doesn't believe in revelation at all, okay? I mean, like, is that not the know-it-all of all know-it-alls? Like, a literal fedora, right? Like, it's unbelievable. I just, a literal sophomoric fedora became, like, the founding father of our, nation, right? It's just amazing hubris. But, okay. The thing is, though, however, like, many of you, and especially if I have any Straussian visitors these days, right? Like, many of you doubt of revelation just like Ben Franklin. Many of you think like Ben Franklin. And many of you think that's probably a based move. You think, like, oh, these Puritans were so, what's this? They were parochial and patriarchal and all that mean stuff. And Ben Franklin, the Kurt Cobain of his day, just shook it all off, and he was like, that's all fake. And so you think that might be, like, kind of based or whatever. Well, like, I'm going to dispute that here in a minute. But let him continue this paragraph. It gets even more interesting. He says, quote, "Some books against deism fell into my hands. They were said to be the substance of sermons preached at Boyle's lectures." That's the Royal Society thing in London. And I'm going to have to explain this. Let me just read this to you. Listen carefully to 5 lines, and then I'll explain it, because it is kind of weirdly phrased. I'll start again. He says, "Some books against deism fell into my hands. They were said to be the substance of sermons preached at Boyle's lectures. It happened that they wrought an effect on me quite contrary to what was intended by them. For the arguments of the deists, which were quoted to be refuted, appeared to me to be much stronger than the refutations. In short, I soon became a thorough deist." And then a few sentences later he adds, "Revelation had indeed no weight with me as such." All right, so what does that section mean? Some books against deism. The reason this is confusing is because in your psyoped minds, you hear books against deism and you picture like new atheist books. You figure like, okay, if the book is against deism, then it must be like for atheism. But that's not what it was. Books against deism would have been like Trinitarian, Presbyterian, normal Christian books, and the deism was the subversive, progressive, new agey, kind of out there thing. And so Franklin reads these books written by, the likes of, I don't know the names off. It would have been like Jonathan Edwards type people, right? Sort of early, like Christian Enlightenment defenders trying to like channel Thomas Aquinas almost and basically like prove God, or prove the Trinity in particular, I guess. But what happens is the deists don't believe all that stuff. They basically, like the deists were, they were basically atheists. They called themselves deists probably to not get in trouble or something like that. So that's the first opening here. And again, to me, this is really frustrating because it's like, here's a 15-year-old kid, and like you have to picture, he's in Philadelphia, which is, it's definitely a church-going place, even in 1721. Everyone's going, they have to go to the Presbyterian church, you have to pay to get a pew. Like, you don't skip church, But Ben Franklin just decides when he's 15 years old, like, this is fake and I'm not going to go anymore. And it's like, well, it's kind of like, well, what are you going to be then? What are you now, Ben Franklin? And to be honest, like, now you're a modern. Like, and in my imagination, and this is one of the things I want to talk to Athenian Stranger about this week, like, this is when modernism starts. The very moment when Ben Franklin decides to stop going to church. So I'm going to read you a little more about that process right now. Ben Franklin, how did he decide to stop going to church? Well, he actually says when he was 15, he kind of, like as I just read to you, he became a deist, but like he was 15. He had to still keep going to church for a while. But it's when he's let's see, what year is this? This would be, I think he says this is like 1825, so he's probably like 21 now, or 19, or somewhere in there. But here's what he says. How much of this do you want to hear? It's pretty good reading. Yeah, let me just read you a little chunk of this. He says, "I had been religiously educated as a Presbyterian, and though some of the dogmas of that persuasion, such as the eternal decrees of God, election, reprobation, etc., appeared to me unintelligible, others doubtful, and I early absented myself from the public assemblies of the sect, Sunday being my studying day, I never was without some religious principles." So the first thing he says there is like, basically, he just decided to stop going to church and replace it with studying. So like this is where he substitutes scholarship for what had been a sacred right, And I want you to notice that's a very different like order of magnitude or of like function in the mind, right? So he continues here. He says, "I never doubted, for instance, the existence of the deity, and that he made the world, and governed it by his providence, that the most acceptable service to God was the doing good to man, that our souls are immortal, and that all crime will be punished and virtue rewarded either here or hereafter. These I esteemed the essentials of every religion, and being to be found in all the religions we had in our country, I respected them all, though with different degrees of respect, as I found them more or less mixed with the other articles which, without any tendency to inspire, promote, or confirm morality, served principally to divide us and make us unfriendly to one another." End quote. Well, I hope you hear in that just the absolute, like, 2021, NPR listening college sophomore who's like, I respect all the religions and has a coexist bumper. Like, this is Ben Franklin. He invented this. And it's like kind of all at once, you know. To me, I don't know. I find it to be pitiably prideful that, like, you know, to think that you could just kind of move past all that and like not understand that your whole entire culture had been built on Christian principles, Christian order for more than 1,000 years, and it's just fake to imagine that you can like pull that part of your culture out and it won't change everything. I mean, and by the way, I mean, where am I going with this? I'm going to suggest that, like, of course, Ben Franklin became the American revolutionary, right? Like, because you don't get to there until you have this level of straight up, like, walking away from the established religion of the land. Okay, so let's see, keep reading. He says, though I seldom attended any public worship, I had still an opinion of its propriety and of its utility when rightly conducted, and I regularly paid my annual subscription for the support of the only Presbyterian minister or meeting we had in Philadelphia. He used to visit me sometimes as a friend and admonish me to attend his administrations, and I was now and then prevailed on to do so once for 5 Sundays successively. He's you know, it's a joke, like I went to church 5 Sundays in a row. Had he been the preacher, this is unbelievable. It's even italicized. He even italicizes it. Just believe me, I guess. He says, had he been, in my opinion, a good preacher, perhaps I might have continued, notwithstanding the occasion I had for the Sunday's leisure in my course of study. But his discourses were chiefly either polemic arguments or explications of the peculiar doctrines of our sect, and were all to me very dry, uninteresting, and unedifying, since not a single moral principle was inculcated or enforced, their aim seeming to be rather to make us Presbyterians than good citizens. And finally, he took for his text that verse from the 4th chapter of Philippians, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, or of good report, if there be of any virtue, of any praise, think on these things. And I imagined in a sermon on such a text we could not miss having some morality, but he confined himself to 5 points only as meant by the apostle. And then he goes, 1, keeping holy the Sabbath day, 2, being diligent in reading the Holy Scriptures, 3, attending duly the public worship, 4, partaking of the sacrament, 5, paying a due respect to God's ministers. And then Franklin says, here's the punctuation, he says, these might be all good things, but as they were not the kind of good things that I expected from the text, I despaired of ever meeting with them from any other, was disgusted, and attended his preaching no more. So yeah, that was 1728. He was 22 years old. And that's how church ends as the sort of unchallenged authority in American, in pre-American, I guess like colonial Britain, American life. Now, you might think, well, what happens next? Ben Franklin is 22. He stops going to church. He becomes like a deist, atheist, basically. And it's 1728. You'd think he'd go like straight to the brothel and, indulge his moral, like, you know what I mean? Like, because isn't God what stops us from doing? Nope, not with Ben Franklin. He actually says in the next paragraph, it was about, this is a funny, crazy thing to say. It does strike me as exactly the kind of thing that a 22-year-old who feels like pride in his atheism would do, right? He's like, I discovered there is no God. And what does he do? Because now he's like one of the great men, he says, it was about this time that I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. And then he says, so he conjures up this list. I wish I could show you this clearer, but do you see right there is the first 5 or 6 of them? He makes a list of 13 virtues. I'm going to say them to you right now. Temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. There's a little note under all of these. The last 2 are funny. Number 12, chastity says, rarely use venery, right? That's your junk, but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. And then 13, humility. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. Now, look, I mean, is it just me or is it strange? Like, I mean, to me, it always begged the question. It's like, well, what makes these things good? I mean, who's to say these are good things, you know? And this is like, I've been, I'm serious. I've been trying to figure out Leo Strauss. I seem to be the only conservative in America who has read some Strauss and doesn't love it. I don't know how this is possible. There seems to be no opposition. My concern is that they crush opposition or something like that. I don't know. But my sense, okay, so like Strauss goes, look, like the ancients had something important and we're a bunch of moderns and we need to go back and learn from them or something. Well, okay, let's define ancient and modern. Because what Strauss seems to me to do is to just evade entirely the question of Christianity's influence on culture. Like, I don't know if he never went to Florence or saw the cathedrals all over Europe. I mean, all of the art seems to be nothing to him. Like, the epics, the stories, Don Quixote, Shakespeare, it's all suffused with Christianity. But I guess that's nothing, right? Like, whereas in my mind, like Christianity, yeah, you could say it's pre-modern. Like that's how it is. If you like Christianity, if you believe in God, if you believe in miracles, if you can read Venerable Bede's English history, the ecclesiastical history of the English people, and like believe that some of that stuff happened, miracles, Joan of Arc and so on. That's pre-modern until you get to Ben Franklin, who at age 15 starts doubting that revelation is possible. So for him, all of a sudden, all the saints, Paul himself, John the Baptist, Joan of Arc, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, the Cloud of Unknowing, Meister Eckhart, it's all fake. None of these people ever had any significant religious revelations at all, and yet, like, so you would think, like, you'd go, okay, so there's no such thing as God, fine, but somehow Franklin essentially just doubles down and becomes even more moral than the people around him who are going to Presbyterian church. And it's not like he's doing it in some like radically different way. No, it's like temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry. Like, where do you think? I mean, I guess you could try to pretend as if these were, Roman Stoic virtues or something like that. But that he's not interested in that. He doesn't quote that. That doesn't seem to be his source for it. So the real question is like, how does this guy talk about arriving at, moral perfectionism? How does he go on later in his life to talk about justice all the time if he has no concept of the good that transcends, right? It's like he's very much a modern in that sense. And like, I don't mean to say Ben Franklin like deserves all the blame in history, but Ben Franklin, like, it's a pretty slippery, it looks greasy down this slope from Ben Franklin to, equality and rights and all that kind of thing, right? Another couple of stories, all of you know the story of Ben Franklin with the key tied to the string and the lightning, and he's inventing electricity or whatever. Or you've heard of him, he invents the bifocal lenses. Or I heard another story, I don't know how apocryphal or true this one is, but apparently, in Philadelphia in the late or middle 18th century, it was always raining and cold and so on. And Franklin lamented the fact that he would always have to make a 1 mile trek to the pub or whatever and get his boots all wet. And so, in the muddy streets, Franklin just invented sidewalks, basically. He, just kind of like railroad track looking raised pieces of wood that would stay dry enough in the rain that his boots wouldn't have to get sloshy and soaked. Well, what does that signify? Like, why do I know that story? I used to use that story to suggest to my students that in Franklin, one of the things that emerges as you leave the pre-modern world is the idea of progress, right? So the pre-moderns didn't have this idea that it was going to be better for their parents, that technology was going to be better all the time. It was, no, we just are the same. We're just going to farm the same as mom did. We're going to eat the same foods as mom did. We're going to play the same folk songs forever and read the same Bible forever. That's it. We're saved in Christ. You don't need anything else. You don't need Plato because you've got Christianity, which is next, right? It's beyond Plato. This is the synthesis that Plato and others gave rise to. And so, that's where everybody was at the time, just kind of stuck in that cyclical history, I guess, something like that. But Franklin has this idea that, no, we're going to make the world better. Things are going to constantly be getting better by a notch every generation, and that includes our, moral behaviors and our technologies, and, we're going to invent new things, and so on. Now, along with this comes this other view, I think not surprising at all, that essentially, I hope you're with me because I'm saying a lot, right? I'm saying basically the modern age begins when you reject revelation and when you initiate a program of progress. And I guess that means it means technological progress, political progress, moral progress, and so on. Now, another part of this is that Franklin, because he begins, this seems to me, this seems like a flow chart. It's like, because this, then this. Okay, so in his youth, he rejects Christian tradition and all of the traditions and the norms of his, ancestors, and he essentially discards them as arbitrary constructs all of a sudden. And so what you get in Franklin is the birth of this idea of, is historicism the right word to use from the Straussians, I guess, of this is only the way we're doing it because it's here and now, but it could be arbitrarily different, right? So just to rewind a little, if you look at one of his essays famously anthologized in all the readers, or you can find it online, called Remarks Concerning the Savages of North America. One of the things he says here, well, actually, I'm just going to summarize this story. I won't even really quote from it, maybe. He says that he was invited to this conversation between the Six Nations and the government of Pennsylvania in 1744. 1744. The Six Nations were the Iroquois, by the way. And the letter that Pennsylvania sends to the Iroquois says, listen, if you want to send us 6 of your youths, we will educate them at the University of Pennsylvania. It's a charity gesture or something. And so the chief writes back, and somehow Ben Franklin has a copy of his letter. And the letter basically says, this is what the letter from the chief back to the college says, for we know, first of all, they say, no thank you, we're not going to send our sons to your college, okay? For we know that you highly esteem the kind of learning taught in those colleges, and that the maintenance of our young men, while with you, would be very expensive to you. We are convinced, therefore, that you mean to do us good by your proposal, and we thank you heartily. But you who are wise must know that different nations have different conceptions of things, and you will therefore not take it amiss if our ideas of this kind of education happen not to be the same with yours. We have had some experience of it. Several of our young men were formerly brought up at the colleges of the northern provinces. They were instructed in all your sciences, but when they came back to us, they were bad runners, ignorant of every means of living in the woods, unable to bear either cold or hunger, knew neither how to build a cabin, take a deer, or kill an enemy, spoke our language imperfectly, and were therefore neither fit for hunters, warriors, nor counselors. They were totally good for nothing. We are, however, nonetheless obliged by your kind offer, though we decline in accepting it, and to show our grateful sense of it, the gentlemen of Virginia will send us 12 of their sons. We will take care of their education, instruct them in all we know, and make men of them. So, that's postmodernism, right? That's the idea that, there's just cultural differences. There's no truth anywhere that transcends anything like this. And that like Ben Franklin basically thinks that the Indian chief has said a very like wise and snazzy thing here in suggesting that like, the different nations do things differently and so on, right? So part of what you have to see in Franklin is that his disbelief in his God, which turns into a disbelief in the like truth and righteousness of his own civilization, turns into a kind of like just radical subjectivity, just relativism in terms of like, culture. It's like they, do genital mutilation over there and we don't do it here, and who cares, basically, right? Well, like, I don't think that's the, like, I don't get the impression that that's the, like, based resolution to the kind of current political crisis that we're all sort of looking at right now in America and the West and around the world. In fact, if anything, it seems to me like we're all just living in Ben Franklin world now, right? So let me take a breath here. Sorry, the COVID is getting to me a little bit. I'm a little tired. I get a little sweaty or tired or something. So anyway, I am having this interesting conversation Friday with Athenian Stranger, and yeah, he's generous to come on the show because I already told him like we're sort of Strauss skeptical here, but I was lying awake in bed last night just trying to conceive of how this all fits together, and to me the question is like, look, if the world before Ben Franklin featured people who maybe, were not all hyper literate. Maybe they weren't all inventing bifocals. Okay? I mean, there's something to be said for progress. I understand. Like, we like public sanitation, we like electricity, or, whatever. We like these kinds of things. But in the world before that, people didn't constantly have this thought about how, like, how all of you have grown up seeing, like, it's so like screwed up that everybody has seen like some, like, a Buddhist ceremony, from the inside of a temple. Everyone has seen Hindus do their worship. Everybody has seen like, some Bantu tribe in Africa sucking blood from a goat or whatever. Like, this is because it's all been inflicted on us by, the kind of globalist media that wants us to like, it just wants to make sure that none of us believe enough in our own culture that we don't go looking external to it. This was one of the things that I remember reading in Plutarch's Lycurgus, is that like Lycurgus's point was, look, it's like he didn't want the people coming in and out of Sparta all the time. Because the idea was, he said, like, people said, is it because you don't want them stealing our technologies or our, manners and so on? He said, no, it's not that at all. He said, I don't want our people being like lowered by their encounter with outside, manners and mores and so on. But that becomes like increasingly impossible in this hyper cosmopolitanized modern world, right? So one of the things I'm interested in with Strauss is, it's like, okay, he suggests this problem. I mean, Strauss would seem to understand the problem of relativism, of, kind of like runaway multiculturalism, of modernism and so on. But then it's like, well, what's the solution? Why can't the solution just be a return to simple country Christianity, where we all believe, and anyone who doesn't becomes a kind of like outsider? You know what I mean? Of course, I know why he's not going to say he likes that. It's because he's not a Christian. Like, that's the main unspoken thing in all of Strauss. It's why he reads, Machiavelli and Plato and Spinoza, and he doesn't read, and probably Ben Franklin. I wouldn't be surprised if he's into, I know he's into like the founders and, some of the English Enlightenment and so on. But like, he's not reading Venerable Bede. He's not reading Eusebius. He doesn't quote Boethius. It's like, it's because these people are Christians, and that's hard for him to, bring on board, I guess, right? It's hard for Leo Strauss to bring that on board because he's the student of, Maimonides, and he grew up specifically very not Christian. So anyway, so that's part of it. Now the other thing is, I'm just thinking out loud here. I also am curious. It's like, I don't go so far as to say like, okay, you shouldn't read this. I'm just saying that it seems to me, if I grew up Jewish in the early 20th century in Germany and had to leave in 1931 or 33 or whenever he left and came to America, to me, certainly that particular childhood and like reading Maimonides and so on would have a significant impact on my thought. You know what I mean? And so if I'm looking at like potential teachers of Plato, I don't it's it's not that I'm not going to read Strauss, but it's like I'm going to want to find somebody who has more like my national experience rather than his. You know what I mean? It's like I'm looking for a Christian basically who's going to teach me Plato. Now, of course, I've heard Athenian Stranger and others say that in Strauss's mind, like Plato's cave is below the surface, and below that, the cave below the cave is Christianity, and that's how screwed up we all are, right? So in Strauss's mind, this like that really digging people out of Christianity is almost like step one to like enlightenment as he understands it, up through which you would have to climb out of Christianity and then I guess somehow out of Plato's cave to see the sun itself, justice itself. But to me, this just completely begs the question. It's like, well, okay, let's say it's not Christianity, right? I mean, what is it then, right? Like, it's not as easy as saying return to the ancients. It's like, well, yeah, we have Plato and Aristotle we can look at. Those are not the same, by the way, first of all. I mean, they're not the same. Like, you can read Plato's Republic and Laws alongside Aristotle's Politics, and it's not like there's a lot of there's differences, okay? But more than that, it's like that's only Athens, basically, right? So, like, if you really wanted to, you would have to, again, read, Herodotus carefully, read Thucydides carefully, read Plutarch, understand how different Solon's laws were from, like, Kyrgyz's laws, from Pericles' laws. Like, which one of these ancients has the answer, right? Like, and there is no solution to that. There's not, like, I don't hear Strauss going, like, well, Pericles got it right. We should just, do that exactly. And if he does, I think a lot of us would, first of all, applaud the final clarity. It's like, my gosh, because, I've now listened to, probably 60 hours of Strauss talking. I've read 2 of his books. I'm pretty tired of it, and I have no idea what this guy thinks, like, public policy should be. And I understand the thing about, like, oh, he's got you right where he wants you, like, it's aporia, haha, like, now you have to think for yourself or something. It's like, yeah, okay, but there are these think tanks that are Straussian at Claremont, at Hillsdale. What are they advocating for, right? And it's hard to find it. It's like, well, it's kind of like vague liberty posting. It's like, they'll even, like, throw in a mention of the borders and so on, but you notice it never, like, culminates in policy victories that would be like true BTFOing of like the liberal Cthulhu cathedral that's always swimming left. So to me, I'm Strauss hesitant still in the sense that it seems like it's running cover for just the kind of liberalism that you can't blame Strauss for wanting America to have been, in the 1930s when he arrived here, because the German model was obviously not preferable and sort of a disaster and didn't work and was, mean and all that. But, like, to me, that's not the only alternative to hyper postmodern relativistic, like, leftism, right? And so what I'm looking for is some sort of just acknowledgement that even if it's not what Strauss wants, it makes sense that we had Christianity. Most Americans are still Christians. It's like Christianity is our best hope for giving people a center of gravity from which we can reason. Because if you don't have that, you truly have just complete diffusion of meaning and values and so on. I'm not averse to, white people posting or whatever, but whiteness comes with no moral content. Just as I said about the ancients, it's like, is whiteness what built Stonehenge, or is it what built, the Globe Theater, or is it what built, the fighting machine of World War I, or did it, build the, globo homo clown world that is London right now? Like, well, it was the same set of genes. They're just doing things differently. And so we have to figure out what our values will be at the foundation so that you can make value judgments downstream from there. And to me, there is nothing but Christianity. I mean, for Strauss, maybe it's Judaism. Like, go to Zion, and like you can, that makes sense there. Like, I get it there. I don't think Judaism is going to take over America and be the foundation on which we sort of base justice in this country. And I don't think Strauss was saying it should be. So what is it, right? That's where we're headed here. And it's the same question I had for Ben Franklin. Now, of course, with Franklin, it's like, well, what is it, right? Think. I mean, Franklin participated in writing the Declaration of Independence. So much of this is like based on Montesquieu and Locke and all of that stuff. I'm not an expert in the sources that those guys at the time were reading, but I may do an episode coming soon here on both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists to give us a little bit more to go on here. I should be cured of COVID by Friday, hopefully, and I'm really looking forward to the secret stream, so make sure you read some Leo Strauss and prepare some good questions. And then remember, episode 100 will be on the Book of Galatians by the Apostle Paul, to whom revelation came directly. See you next time on The Godward Show.